The moment Caleb Martinez slammed Mackenzie's head against the metal locker, her anxiety disorder, necklace C, one thing that kept her panic attacks manageable, shattered across Lincoln High's polished hallway floor. What the star wrestling captain didn't know was that this weak, anxiety-ridden girl had been hiding a black belt in judo for 3 years, and in exactly 47 seconds, his reputation would be destroyed in front of 200 livestream viewers. By the time you finish this story, you'll understand why the phrase mental weakness became the most expensive words ever spoken at Lincoln High. If you've ever been judged for your mental health struggles or watched someone weaponize your vulnerabilities against you, this story will remind you that strength comes in forms most people never see coming. The afternoon sun streamed through Lincoln High's towering windows, casting geometric shadows across hallways that had witnessed both triumph and torment for over 50 years. At 17, Mackenzie Sullivan Mack, to the few who knew her well enough to use nicknames, moved through these corridors like a ghost seeking refuge. Her auburn hair fell in carefully arranged waves that partially concealed her face, a protective curtain she'd perfected over years of avoiding unwanted attention. The oversized cardigan she wore daily served dual purposes, hiding the lean muscle definition beneath and providing comfort during the anxiety episodes that struck without warning. Most students at Lincoln saw exactly what Mac intended them to see: a fragile girl whose hands trembled during presentations, who always chose seats near exits, and who wore that silver medical alert necklace that marked her as different. What they couldn't see was the way she unconsciously counted her breathing in perfect 4-7-8 patterns, or how her seemingly nervous fidgeting was actually the muscle memory of defensive positioning drilled into her bones since childhood. Mac had learned long ago that survival sometimes meant hiding your greatest strengths beneath your most visible weaknesses. The medical alert necklace that hung against her collarbone contained more than identification. It held a small vial of lavender oil that helped ground her during panic attacks, a technique she'd learned from Mrs. Rodriguez, the school counselor who understood that anxiety wasn't weakness, but awareness turned up to dangerous volumes. What even Mrs. Rodriguez didn't fully grasp was that Mac's therapeutic judo sessions, recommended 3 years ago to help with anxiety management, had evolved far beyond simple stress relief. Under the guidance of Master Chen at the community center, Mac had discovered that her hyper-awareness, the same trait that triggered her anxiety, made her anticipate attacks with uncanny precision. Her father, federal prosecutor James Sullivan, had initially worried that martial arts might increase his daughter's stress levels. Irish immigrants themselves, the Sullivan family had built their American dream on the foundation of education and law. Violence, even controlled violence, seemed antithetical to their values. But as Mac progressed from white belt to black, as her panic attacks decreased and her confidence grew in measured increments, James began to understand that his daughter had found something precious, a way to transform her sensitivity into strength. He never imagined that skill would soon become her shield against predators who mistook anxiety for helplessness. The bullying at Lincoln High operated on multiple levels, some obvious, and others insidiously subtle. At the surface level, there were the typical hierarchies: athletes versus academics, wealthy versus scholarship students, popular versus invisible. But beneath that familiar ecosystem lurked something darker, a systematic targeting of students whose differences made them vulnerable. Mental health conditions, learning disabilities, physical limitations all became ammunition for those who confused cruelty with power. What made this targeting particularly sinister was its organization. What appeared to be random teenage meanness was actually coordinated harassment designed to break spirits and destroy futures. Caleb Martinez understood power in its rawest form. As Lincoln High's wrestling captain and the son of Martinez Construction, the company that had built half the commercial developments in the district, never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through dominance or money. His approach to conflict was straightforward: identify weakness, exploit it ruthlessly, and ensure everyone witnessed the victory. Standing 6 feet 2 inches, with the broad shoulders and narrow waist of an elite athlete, Caleb moved through Lincoln High like an apex predator surveying his territory. His black hair was always perfectly styled, his olive skin maintained a year-round tan that spoke of expensive gym memberships, and his dark brown eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd learned early That fear was a currency more valuable than friendship. What distinguished Caleb from typical high school bullies was his business acumen, a trait inherited from his father, who'd built a construction empire through strategic intimidation and political connections. Caleb had transformed harassment into profit through the Lincoln Anxiety Challenge, a betting ring that wagered on students' breaking points. The operation was sophisticated. His crew identified vulnerable targets, orchestrated triggers designed to provoke public breakdowns, live-streamed the results for maximum humiliation, and collected money from classmates betting on who would crack first and how dramatically they'd fall apart. The crew Caleb had assembled reflected different aspects of modern teenage predation. Brandon Park, the son of Korean immigrants who'd built a successful tech consulting firm, served as the operation's technical architect. His role involved setting up hidden cameras, managing live-stream feeds, and ensuring that evidence of their activities remained untraceable through sophisticated digital footwork. Brandon's motivation wasn't purely financial. Having been bullied himself in middle school for his academic intensity, he'd learned that joining the oppressors was safer than remaining vulnerable to their attacks. Jesse Thompson represented the muscle of the operation, 6 feet 4 inches of corn-fed Iowa farm boy whose family had moved to Illinois when agricultural economics forced them off their land. Jesse's massive frame and intimidating presence made physical confrontation unnecessary in most situations. His mere presence beside Caleb was usually sufficient to ensure compliance. Unlike his companions, Jesse rarely spoke during their operations, serving instead as a silent reminder that their threats carried weight beyond words. His participation stemmed less from malice than from loyalty. Caleb had recruited him during his awkward freshman year, offering friendship in exchange for protection services. Aiden Walsh completed the triangle as their social media coordinator, responsible for amplifying the humiliation through strategic posting across platforms. The son of a prominent local attorney, Aiden possessed an intuitive understanding of how to craft content that maximized engagement while maintaining plausible deniability. His specialty involved creating fake accounts that would spread rumors, share embarrassing content, and coordinate harassment campaigns that appeared organic rather than orchestrated. Aiden's pale complexion, sharp features, and prematurely thinning blonde hair gave him an appearance that adults found trustworthy, a trait he exploited ruthlessly in his role as the crew's public face. The betting ring they operated had generated over $50,000 in the past 18 months, with stakes ranging from small lunch money wagers to significant amounts that suggested adult participation. The targets were chosen based on specific criteria: visible vulnerability, limited social support, and circumstances that made retaliation unlikely. Students with anxiety disorders topped their target list because panic attacks provided dramatic visual content that performed well on social media. The crew had perfected triggers designed to induce maximum distress: sudden loud noises, crowded situations, public speaking demands, and social isolation tactics that pushed vulnerable students past their coping thresholds. Previous victims had responded predictably to the systematic harassment. Sarah Kim had transferred schools after a live-streamed panic attack during a mandatory presentation went viral within the district. Her parents, both medical professionals, chose geographical escape rather than legal confrontation. Marcus Washington had attempted suicide following a coordinated social media campaign that convinced his peers he was dangerous. He survived but required residential treatment and homeschooling to complete his education. Ashley Chen had simply disappeared one day, her family relocating without forwarding information, leaving behind rumors that Caleb's crew had discovered something particularly damaging about her background. Each successful campaign strengthened the crew's confidence and refined their methods. They learned to avoid targets with prominent parents, to focus on students whose families lacked resources for legal challenges, and to maintain enough plausible deniability that adult intervention remained unlikely. The betting aspect provided financial motivation while creating a network of complicit classmates who had monetary interests in seeing the harassment succeed. Most importantly, they'd learned that anxiety disorders provided the most reliable triggers for public breakdowns that translated into viral content and profitable wagers. Mac had avoided their attention for 2 years through careful invisibility and strategic withdrawal from situations that might mark her as vulnerable. She attended required classes, completed assignments with minimal interaction, and spent lunch periods in the library or counselor's office, where adult supervision provided protection. Her strategy had been successful until the week when college application deadlines forced her into higher visibility through required activities that couldn't be avoided or postponed. Honor Society induction, National Merit Scholarship interviews, and mandatory senior presentations had placed her on Caleb's radar at precisely the moment when her future felt most vulnerable to disruption. The first sign that she'd become a target came through digital channels, designed to seem random but carefully calculated to unsettle her growing confidence. Anonymous messages appeared on her phone containing screenshots of her social media activity with cruel commentary about her appearance, her family's modest circumstances, and her academic intensity. The messages included details that could only have been obtained through systematic surveillance: her father's work schedule, her mother's part-time job at the medical clinic, and her own therapy appointments that should have been confidential. Most disturbing were references to her judo training that suggested someone had been watching her outside school grounds. The psychological pressure escalated through tactics designed to trigger her anxiety without appearing overtly threatening. Her locker combination was somehow obtained, and her belongings rearranged in ways that suggested invasion without constituting theft. Books moved to different shelves, photographs turned face down, and personal items repositioned just enough to create unease. Her parking spot was repeatedly taken by vehicles that blocked her access, forcing her to arrive late for first period and creating the academic pressure that exacerbated her anxiety symptoms. Most insidiously, false rumors were spread through digital channels about her mental health status, suggesting she was dangerous, unstable, or receiving medication that made her unpredictable. Mac initially responded to these attacks through the coping strategies she'd developed over years of anxiety management. She documented incidents in a journal her therapist had recommended for tracking triggers and responses. She practiced breathing exercises and grounding techniques during moments of peak stress. She reached out to her support network of family and counselors when the pressure became overwhelming. What she didn't realize was that her healthy responses to systematic harassment were being monitored and exploited by attackers who understood exactly how to escalate their campaign at moments when she felt most vulnerable. The breakthrough in their surveillance came through technology that Mac hadn't considered a threat. Brandon's technical skills included social engineering that allowed him to access her digital communications through methods that appeared legitimate but violated her privacy systematically. Her therapy appointment schedule became known to the crew, allowing them to time their attacks for maximum psychological impact. Her college application essays were somehow obtained and shared among betting participants who wagered on whether the stress would force her to withdraw applications or miss deadlines entirely. Most damaging was their access to communications with her father about his current caseload information that would later prove far more dangerous than anyone initially realized. The first direct confrontation occurred on a Thursday morning in November, when Mac arrived at school to find her car surrounded by Caleb's crew. They weren't blocking her path or making obvious threats. Instead, they were simply present in a way that made clear they were watching her, evaluating her responses, and preparing for something larger. Caleb leaned against his pickup truck, a massive Ford F-250 that his father had given him for his 18th birthday, wearing his leather jacket and the confident smile of someone who'd never faced consequences for his actions. His dark eyes tracked Mac's movement as she gathered her books, noting how her hands shook slightly as she checked her phone, and how she unconsciously touched her anxiety necklace when she realized she was being observed. "Morning, Mac," Caleb called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot with forced friendliness that made her skin crawl. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" The question itself was innocuous, but the context made clear that this was a message rather than conversation. He knew her nickname despite never having spoken to her directly. He knew her schedule well enough to time this encounter perfectly, and he knew that his presence with his full crew would trigger the anxiety response he'd been studying for weeks. Mac's reaction, a quick nod and faster walk toward the building, provided exactly the intelligence he needed to plan his next escalation. The pattern continued throughout the following weeks with gradually increasing intensity designed to build pressure while maintaining plausible deniability. Caleb would appear in her vicinity at moments when she felt most vulnerable: outside the counselor's office after therapy sessions, near her locker during class changes when hallways were crowded, and in the parking lot when she was alone with her thoughts. Each encounter was brief and seemingly innocent, but the cumulative effect was a constant awareness that she was being watched, evaluated, and prepared for something she couldn't yet identify. The psychological pressure was expertly applied enough to create constant stress, but not enough to justify adult intervention. Mac's response to this systematic stalking revealed both her strengths and her vulnerabilities in ways that informed Caleb's final strategy. Her anxiety symptoms increased visibly, her hands shook more frequently, her breathing became labored during crowded moments, and her concentration suffered in classes where she'd previously excelled. However, she also demonstrated resilience that surprised her tormentors. She continued attending school regularly, maintained her academic performance through sheer determination, and even began taking different routes through the building that suggested strategic thinking rather than random avoidance. Most intriguingly, to Caleb, she started carrying herself differently: straighter posture, more deliberate movements, and occasional moments of stillness that seemed almost predatory in their intensity. The decision to escalate to physical confrontation came after Caleb's crew observed Mac's meeting with Mrs. Rodriguez about anxiety accommodations for her upcoming college interviews. Brandon's technical surveillance had captured enough of their conversation to understand that Mac was seeking formal protections that might limit their ability to continue their harassment campaign. The phrase therapeutic judo sessions had appeared in documentation that Brandon accessed through questionable methods, but they interpreted this as confirmation that Mac was even more vulnerable than they'd initially assessed after all. What kind of threat could therapy pose to their systematic campaign of psychological warfare? Their fundamental misunderstanding of Mac's judo training reflected their broader ignorance about the relationship between anxiety and awareness. They saw her visible symptoms: trembling hands, rapid breathing, hypervigilancy as evidence of weakness. Rather than recognizing these as adaptive responses to genuine threats, they interpreted her withdrawal from social situations as cowardice rather than strategic conservation of energy for battles that mattered. Most critically, they failed to understand that her anxiety had taught her to read situations with extraordinary precision. She could sense aggression, anticipate violence, and prepare for confrontation long before most people recognized danger was approaching. The trap they set for Mac reflected 3 years of experience in breaking vulnerable students through public humiliation. The plan involved isolating her in the school's basement storage area during a false fire alarm that Caleb had arranged through his father's connections to the building maintenance crew. The location was chosen for its lack of security cameras and its distance from areas where teachers might intervene. The timing was calculated to occur during the lunch period, when maximum numbers of students would be available to witness whatever content they planned to livestream. The false emergency would force Mac into a confined space where her anxiety would be at its peak, creating optimal conditions for the psychological breakdown they needed to win their most ambitious betting pool yet. What Caleb and his crew failed to anticipate was that Mac had spent months preparing for exactly this type of confrontation. Her father's work as a federal prosecutor had taught their family to think like investigators. Her therapy sessions had equipped her with tools for managing extreme stress, and her judo training had given her both physical skills and mental discipline that transformed fear into focused energy. Most importantly, she'd begun wearing a body camera borrowed from her father's equipment closet that would document whatever happened in ways that could be used for legal prosecution rather than social media entertainment. The basement storage room where they cornered Mac represented the perfect metaphor for the systematic inequality that defined Lincoln High's social ecosystem. Located beneath the newer wing of the building, the space served as a repository for outdated equipment, broken furniture, and institutional memories that the administration preferred to keep hidden rather than properly disposed of. The fluorescent lighting flickered intermittently, creating an atmosphere that felt more like an interrogation room than an educational facility. The concrete walls amplified sound in ways that made whispers seem like shouts while muffling screams that might otherwise attract attention. Most significantly, the room contained evidence of previous attacks, graffiti that named victims, dates that marked successful harassment campaigns, and crude tally marks that suggested this space had been used for systematic abuse over multiple years. When Mac entered the storage room following the false fire alarm, she immediately recognized the setup for what it was: a carefully orchestrated trap designed to break her spirit while generating content that would destroy her reputation and future prospects. Caleb stood in the center of the space with his arms crossed. His wrestling team warm-up jacket unzipped to reveal the muscular torso that had intimidated countless opponents on the mat. His dark eyes held the cold satisfaction of a predator who'd successfully cornered his prey. Brandon positioned himself near the room's single exit with his phone already recording, while Jesse and Aiden flanked the space to prevent any attempted escape. The betting pool they'd organized for this encounter had reached $12,000, with odds heavily favoring Mac's complete psychological breakdown within the first 10 minutes of confrontation. "Welcome to your intervention, Mac," Caleb said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with practiced cruelty. "We've been watching you for months, studying your little anxiety episodes, learning exactly what makes you tick. Today we're going to show everyone at Lincoln High what real weakness looks like." He gestured to Brandon's phone, where a red recording light indicated they were already live streaming to an audience that had grown to over 300 viewers within the first 60 seconds. "Say hello to your fans, Princess. They've been waiting to see you crack." The systematic destruction of Mac's anxiety necklace represented more than simple property damage. It was a calculated attack on the coping mechanism that had enabled her to function in high-stress situations for over 2 years. Caleb approached her with the deliberate slowness of someone savoring a moment he'd anticipated for weeks, his large hands reaching for the delicate silver chain that represented her connection to stability and control. "Let's see what happens when we take away your security blanket," he said, his fingers closing around the medical alert pendant that contained her grounding oil and emergency contact information. With one sharp pull, he snapped the chain and scattered the pieces across the concrete floor, where they made tiny metallic sounds that seemed disproportionately loud in the confined space. Mac's response to this violation surprised everyone in the room, including herself. Instead of the panic attack that Caleb had anticipated, instead of the tears and pleading that had marked his previous victories, she felt something entirely different, settling over her consciousness like a familiar weight. The hypervigilance that typically accompanied her anxiety shifted into the focused awareness that Master Chen had taught her to cultivate during sparring sessions. Her breathing naturally fell into the controlled rhythm that optimized oxygen flow for physical exertion, and her stance unconsciously adjusted to the balanced positioning that provided maximum options for movement in any direction. She was no longer Max Sullivan, the anxious girl trying to survive high school. She was someone else entirely, someone who had been waiting years for this exact moment to reveal herself. "That necklace was a medical device," Max said quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that made Brandon adjust his camera angle to capture what he sensed was about to become important footage. Destroying medical equipment is assault under Illinois state law. Live streaming someone without consent is a federal crime, and conspiring to harass students based on mental health conditions violates Title IX protections. Her words were delivered with the precision of someone who'd learned legal terminology through dinner conversations with a federal prosecutor, but more importantly, they demonstrated a level of preparation that suggested this confrontation was not proceeding according to Caleb's expectations. The revelation that Mac understood the legal implications of their actions triggered Caleb's transition from psychological warfare to physical intimidation escalation that would prove to be his greatest tactical error. "Nobody cares about your legal mumbo-jumbo," he snarled, moving closer until his 6'2" frame towered over her more petite stature in a display of dominance that had worked countless times before. "Your daddy might be some kind of government lawyer, but money talks louder than law in this town. My father built half of Lincoln High. One phone call from him and your whole family gets run out of this district." What Caleb didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Mac's father was currently serving as the lead prosecutor in a federal investigation into construction industry corruption that included Martinez Construction as a primary target. The threats against Mac weren't just personal harassment. They constituted witness intimidation in a federal case that could result in decades of prison time for everyone involved. More immediately relevant, Mac had been documenting every aspect of their harassment campaign under FBI guidance as part of building a broader case against systematic civil rights violations in educational settings. The body camera she wore wasn't just personal protection. It was evidence collection for a federal prosecution that would make their betting ring seem trivial by comparison. The moment when Caleb's campaign of psychological terror transformed into physical assault marked the point of no return for everyone involved in the basement storage room. Jesse Thompson, following Caleb's gestured command, moved to block Mac's access to the exit, while Aiden Walsh positioned himself to provide a second camera angle for their livestream audience, which had now grown to over 500 viewers drawn by social media posts, promising unprecedented entertainment. Brandon Park adjusted his recording settings to ensure they captured whatever was about to happen in high enough definition to maximize its viral potential. The betting pool associated with their stream had reached $15,000, as viewers wagered not just on whether Mac would break, but on how dramatically her breakdown would unfold for their entertainment. Mac's training had prepared her for exactly this scenario: multiple attackers in a confined space, limited escape routes, and the necessity of neutralizing threats quickly before they could coordinate their assault effectively. Master Chen had taught her that Judo was fundamentally about using an opponent's size and aggression against them. Larger attackers provided more momentum to redirect, more weight to destabilize, and more confidence to exploit through surprise. The months of therapeutic sessions that Caleb had dismissed as evidence of weakness had actually been intensive preparation for precisely this type of confrontation anxiety management, through controlled exposure to stress, physical conditioning through repetitive technique practice, and mental discipline through meditation that allowed clear thinking under extreme pressure. The transformation that occurred when Mac shifted from victim to fighter was visible to everyone watching, both in the basement and through the live stream that was now being recorded by dozens of viewers who sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented. Her posture straightened from defensive hunching to balanced readiness. Her breathing shifted from anxiety-induced rapid patterns to the controlled rhythm that optimized performance, and her eyes changed from darting nervousness to the focused intensity that Master Chen called Zanshina, state of relaxed alertness that allowed complete awareness of one's environment while maintaining readiness for immediate action. Most significantly, her hands stopped trembling and assumed the precise positioning that provided maximum options for defensive or offensive techniques. "My name is Mackenzie Sullivan," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room and through the live stream to hundreds of viewers who suddenly understood they were witnessing something far more significant than typical high school bullying. "I've been training in Judo since I was 10 years old. I hold a second-degree black belt from the International Judo Federation, and I've been documenting your harassment campaign for federal prosecutors who are very interested in civil rights violations, disguised as teenage entertainment." The formal introduction served multiple purposes: establishing her identity for legal documentation, demonstrating her qualifications to use physical force if necessary, and providing clear warning that continued aggression would have consequences far beyond anything they'd anticipated. Caleb's response to Mac's revelation reflected the toxic masculinity that had driven his harassment campaign from its inception. Rather than recognizing the danger he now faced, he interpreted her confidence as a challenge to his dominance that required immediate and decisive response. "You think you can threaten me?" he roared, his face flushing with rage, as he realized that his carefully planned humiliation was transforming into something entirely different. "I'll show you what real power looks like." His charge toward Mac was explosive, but undisciplined raw athletic ability without technique, size without strategy, and anger without intelligence, exactly the type of attack that Judo was designed to neutralize through superior positioning and timing, rather than meeting force with force. The technical execution of Mac's defense represented years of training compressed into a single moment of perfect application. As Caleb's 200-pound frame hurtled toward her with wrestling aggression, she stepped aside at precisely the right angle, while simultaneously gripping his extended arm and using his momentum to guide him past her center of gravity. Her hip placement provided the fulcrum around which his entire body weight rotated, and her coordinated pull-and-lift technique transformed his forward charge into a perfect arc that launched him through the air with devastating efficiency. The throw a classic Ippon Seoi Nage executed with textbook precision sent Caleb crashing into a stack of storage boxes with enough force to scatter equipment across the concrete floor and leave him gasping for breath while trying to comprehend how someone half his size had made him airborne. The silence that followed Caleb's impact lasted exactly 3 seconds before the basement storage room erupted into chaos that would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms and eventually featured in federal court As evidence of both the systematic harassment and its dramatic conclusion, Brandon's phone captured every detail of the throw from the optimal angle to demonstrate its technical perfection, while Aiden's backup recording provided a second perspective that would later be analyzed by martial arts experts who confirmed that Mac's technique represented black belt level skill applied with precision that suggested extensive tournament experience. Jesse Thompson, witnessing his leader's humiliating defeat, made the tactical error of attempting to grab Mac from behind a decision that resulted in him joining Caleb on the floor, courtesy of a backward throw that demonstrated her complete situational awareness and her ability to handle multiple attackers simultaneously. The live stream audience, which had grown to over 800 viewers expecting to witness a vulnerable girl's psychological breakdown, instead found themselves watching the complete reversal of every assumption they'd made about power, weakness, and the relationship between anxiety and strength. Comments flooded the stream faster than moderators could process them, with viewers expressing shock, admiration, and growing awareness that they'd been complicit in systematic harassment that was now being exposed in real time through the very technology intended to perpetuate it. The betting pool associated with Mac's predicted breakdown transformed into something entirely different as viewers began wagering on how many of her attackers she could defeat and whether Caleb would require medical attention for his spectacular impact with the storage equipment. Mac stood in the center of the basement storage room, surrounded by the scattered remnants of Caleb's crew and the evidence of systematic harassment that would soon become federal court exhibits. Her breathing remained controlled, despite the physical exertion. Her stance maintained perfect balance, despite the adrenaline flooding her system, and her expression held the calm confidence of someone who had finally revealed her true identity after years of strategic concealment. The body camera she wore had documented everything in detail that would satisfy even the most demanding legal standards. The live stream had created a permanent record that eliminated any possibility of denying what had occurred, and the betting ring evidence scattered across the floor would provide prosecutors with proof of the organized nature of their harassment campaign. "Brandon," Mac said quietly, her voice carrying absolute authority, as she addressed the crew member still holding his recording phone with trembling hands. "You're going to upload that entire stream to a secure server and provide the access codes to federal investigators who will be arriving shortly. You're going to preserve all betting records, communication logs, and evidence of your systematic targeting of vulnerable students. And you're going to cooperate fully with prosecutors who have been building a case against civil rights violations in educational settings." Her knowledge of legal procedures and evidence preservation reflected months of preparation that went far beyond anything a typical high school student would understand. Preparation that suggested this confrontation was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger strategy that was only beginning to unfold. The sound of footsteps in the corridor above marked the arrival of authorities who had been positioned nearby as part of a coordinated response to what federal investigators had known would eventually escalate to physical confrontation. Mac's father had been tracking Caleb's crew for months as part of his broader investigation into systematic harassment campaigns that violated federal civil rights protections, and the basement storage room had been under electronic surveillance that provided backup documentation for everything the body camera and live stream had recorded. The transformation of victim into victor was complete. But the broader implications of what had occurred were only beginning to become apparent to everyone involved. As official voices echoed down the stairwell and Caleb struggled to comprehend how his moment of triumph had become his complete humiliation, Mac remained perfectly still in the center of the room. No longer the anxious girl who'd entered, seeking shelter from a false fire alarm, but revealed as the federal witness whose systematic documentation of harassment had just provided prosecutors with everything they needed to dismantle not just a teenage betting ring, but an entire network of corruption that connected high school bullying to construction industry, fraud in ways that would shock the community and redefine how power operated at Lincoln High forever. The basement storage room fell silent, except for Caleb's labored breathing and the approaching footsteps of authorities who would transform this moment from personal victory into federal case study. But that transformation, and all its implications for everyone involved, would have to wait for what came next. The footsteps belonged to FBI agent Sarah Chen, whose arrival in the basement storage room marked the culmination of an 18-month federal investigation that had begun with construction fraud and evolved into something far more comprehensive Agent Chen's presence wasn't coincidental. She'd been monitoring the situation through electronic surveillance that had captured every detail of Caleb's harassment campaign, every illegal bet placed on student suffering, and every moment of systematic civil rights violations disguised as teenage entertainment. Her badge gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights as she surveyed the scene, Caleb Martinez groaning amid scattered storage equipment, Jesse Thompson struggling to stand after his encounter with Mac's defensive techniques, and Brandon Park still clutching his phone with the live stream that had just documented federal crimes in real time. Mackenzie Sullivan, Agent Chen said formally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. You've done excellent work documenting this criminal enterprise. Your cooperation with our investigation has provided evidence that will prosecute not only these immediate perpetrators, but the broader network of corruption that enabled their activities. She gestured to the basement room around them, where evidence of systematic harassment covered every surface. This betting ring generated over $75,000 in the past 2 years, involved 12 faculty members who received payments for providing access and information, and targeted 43 students whose mental health conditions made them vulnerable to exploitation. The revelation that faculty members had been complicit in the harassment campaign sent shockwaves through everyone present, including Mac, who had suspected administrative negligence but not active participation in systematic targeting of vulnerable students. Principal Davis stood frozen in the doorway as the implications became clear. His own communications with parents about student accommodations had been shared with Caleb's crew to identify optimal targets. Coach Williams had provided information about students' therapy sessions that informed psychological warfare strategies. Most damaging was the discovery that Nurse Patterson had violated medical confidentiality by sharing information about students' anxiety medications and crisis intervention plans. The construction fraud investigation led us to Martinez Construction's unusual relationship with Lincoln High. Agent Chen continued, pulling out documentation that would transform the local scandal into national news. Miguel Martinez has been paying school personnel to provide information about students whose parents work for competitor companies. Harassment campaigns were designed to pressure families into relocating, leaving their construction contracts vulnerable to takeover. The scope of corruption extended far beyond teenage bullying into systematic economic warfare that used children's mental health as leverage in adult business conflicts. Caleb's attempt to speak was interrupted by the arrival of additional federal agents, local police officers, and emergency medical personnel who began processing what had become an active crime scene. His father, Miguel Martinez, was already in federal custody, arrested that morning on charges of racketeering, Fraude, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. The construction empire that had dominated local politics for 20 years was being dismantled through asset forfeiture. The wrestling scholarship that had represented Caleb's pathway to college success was immediately revoked, his future transformed from promising athletic career to facing federal charges as an adult. Max stood amid the chaos with remarkable composure, her breathing still controlled, and her stance maintaining the balanced readiness that had served her so well during the confrontation. The body camera she wore had captured everything in detail that would satisfy federal court standards. The live stream provided additional documentation that eliminated any possibility of claiming the events were misrepresented, and the betting records scattered across the storage room floor would serve as evidence of the organized nature of their criminal enterprise. Most importantly, her months of patient documentation under FBI guidance had created an unassailable legal case that would serve as a model for prosecuting systematic harassment in educational settings. The courage you've shown over the past 6 months, Agent Chen said quietly to Mac as medical personnel evaluated the defeated members of Caleb's crew, has made it possible to protect dozens of current victims and prevent hundreds of future ones. Your willingness to continue attending school while documenting harassment represents exactly the kind of civic bravery that makes democracy function. The federal case that would emerge from Mac's evidence would establish legal precedents that strengthen protections for students with mental health conditions throughout the country. The transformation of Lincoln High began immediately as news of the federal arrests spread through social media faster than official communications could manage the narrative. Students who had participated in betting pools suddenly found themselves facing potential prosecution as accessories to federal crimes. Those who had remained silent during systematic harassment began speaking out about incidents they'd witnessed but failed to report, and faculty members scrambled to demonstrate their lack of involvement in activities that would end careers and result in criminal charges. The culture of intimidation that had defined social hierarchies for years dissolved within hours as power structures revealed themselves to be built on foundations that couldn't withstand legal scrutiny. Brandon Park's cooperation with federal investigators provided the technical evidence needed to trace the full scope of the harassment network's digital activities. His phone contained records of over 200 students who had been systematically targeted, detailed financial records of betting pools, and communication logs that revealed faculty involvement in providing confidential information. The sophisticated technology that had enabled their harassment campaigns became the mechanism for their prosecution when Brandon's digital forensics skills were redirected toward assisting justice. Jesse Thompson's medical evaluation revealed the effectiveness of Mac's Judo techniques in neutralizing threats without causing permanent injury. His cooperation with investigators stemmed from recognition that his loyalty to Caleb had led him into federal criminal liability. His testimony provided crucial details about the recruitment process that had drawn students into the harassment network and the systematic methods used to identify vulnerable targets. The community response to revelations about the systematic harassment network reflected broader tensions about power, privilege, and accountability that had been building for years beneath Lincoln High's facade of academic excellence. Parents who had assumed their children were safe discovered that wealth and status had been used as weapons against vulnerable families. School board members found themselves facing federal investigation, and local political leaders scrambled to distance themselves from Martinez Construction's influence. The corruption that had seemed like isolated incidents revealed itself as a comprehensive system designed to concentrate power while marginalizing those who lacked resources to defend themselves. Mac's transformation from victim to federal witness to community advocate accelerated as media attention focused on her story and its broader implications for addressing systematic harassment in educational settings. Interview requests came from major news networks, documentary filmmakers, and advocacy organizations that recognized her case as a turning point in how society understood the relationship between mental health conditions and civil rights protections. Her articulate explanations of how anxiety had been weaponized against her and her legal knowledge about federal civil rights enforcement made her a compelling spokesperson for prevention programs and policy reforms. The Judo community's response to Mac's defensive use of martial arts techniques provided validation that extended far beyond her immediate situation. Master Chen's testimony about her training emphasized the discipline, mental preparation, and ethical framework that had enabled her to use physical skills only when absolutely necessary for self-protection. The International Judo Federation's recognition of her case would inspire training programs that integrated mental health awareness with physical education. College admissions committees' responses to Mac's application materials reflected changing attitudes about how adversity and resilience should be evaluated in academic contexts. Her essay about transforming anxiety into advocacy, her documentation of systematic harassment and legal resistance, and her demonstration of courage under extreme pressure created a compelling narrative that distinguished her from typical applicants. Harvard's psychology department offered immediate admission with full scholarship. Yale's law school provided early acceptance, and Stanford's Public Policy Institute invited her to participate in research about systematic harassment prevention. The federal sentencing phase provided Mac with opportunities to address the broader implications of what had occurred, while demonstrating the personal growth that had emerged from her systematic victimization and ultimate triumph. Her victim impact statement, delivered to a packed federal courtroom and broadcast to millions online, articulated how anxiety disorders could become sources of strength when properly supported rather than systematically exploited. Her description of the hypervigilance that anxiety created the same trait that had enabled her to anticipate and document harassment-framed mental health conditions as differences that required accommodation rather than weaknesses that invited exploitation. Caleb Martinez's sentencing to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, reflected both the severity of his crimes and the possibility of rehabilitation through proper intervention. His mandatory therapy sessions would focus on addressing the toxic masculinity that had driven his harassment campaigns. His community service requirements would involve working with anti-bullying organizations, and his restitution payments would fund mental health support services for victims. His wrestling career was permanently ended, but the therapeutic framework of his sentence provided pathways toward redemption. The broader legal precedents established by Mack's case would influence federal civil rights enforcement for decades. The Sullivan v. Lincoln School District decision established that systematic harassment based on mental health conditions constituted discrimination under federal disability rights laws. The precedent required schools to provide the same protections for students with anxiety disorders and depression that had previously been reserved for visible physical disabilities. The decision's emphasis on institutional responsibility would transform how educational administrators approached their legal obligations to protect vulnerable students. Mack's advocacy work expanded beyond legal testimony to include program development that would protect future generations of students from experiencing the systematic harassment she had endured. Her collaboration with the Department of Education resulted in training materials that helped educators recognize the signs of organized harassment campaigns. Her work with the FBI's Civil Rights Division provided technical assistance for investigating similar cases, and her partnership with mental health organizations created resources that helped students understand their rights and develop self-protection strategies. The transformation of Lincoln High into a model for harassment prevention reflected comprehensive policy changes that addressed both individual behavior and institutional culture. The Sullivan Protocol required immediate federal notification of harassment complaints involving mental health conditions, mandatory training for all personnel about civil rights protections, and regular auditing of disciplinary patterns to identify systematic discrimination. The school's culture shifted from competitive hierarchy to collaborative support as students recognized that their safety depended on protecting rather than exploiting each other's vulnerabilities. 5 years after the basement storage room confrontation that had changed everything, Mack stood before a congressional committee investigating systematic harassment in educational settings. Her testimony, carrying the authority of someone who had transformed personal trauma into social change that protected millions of students nationwide. Her black belt in judo had evolved into expertise in federal civil rights law. Her anxiety disorder had become a source of awareness that informed prevention programs, and her experience as a victim had developed into leadership that inspired others to transform their own struggles into advocacy for systematic change. As Mack concluded her congressional testimony with the same calm confidence that had carried her through the basement confrontation years earlier, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from an anxious teenager, hiding her strength, into a national advocate whose courage had rewritten the rules about power, protection, and possibility in educational settings. The judo throw that had shocked Caleb Martinez had become a symbol of resistance that inspired others to defend themselves. The anxiety that had made her a target had become awareness that protected vulnerable students nationwide, and the systematic harassment that had been designed to destroy her future had instead created a legacy that would protect countless others. If Mack's journey resonates with your own experiences of turning vulnerability into strength, consider sharing your story below. Your voice matters in building a community where courage inspires courage. The girl who had once counted her breathing to manage panic attacks had become a woman whose voice counted in conversations that shaped federal policy. And somewhere in schools across America, students who might have been targeted for their vulnerabilities instead found protection in policies that Mack's courage had made possible, creating a safer world where anxiety could be treated as awareness, where differences could be celebrated as strengths, and where the phrase mental weakness would never again become someone's weapon of choice.